What's up guys, it's Josh from Blackout Tinting, and today I want to talk to you about something that I'm very passionate about because it's something that we do every single day here at Blackout, and that is paint correction. This video is to explain what is paint correction, what isn't paint correction, what does it do and what does it not do basically, and how to tell if you need one or should talk to somebody about getting one. In addition to that, we're going to be talking a little bit about paint and sort of doing a deep dive into what exactly is happening when you do a paint correction and why it works. Let's start with what a paint correction is. It's a term that us detailers throw around a lot. If you're a consumer, you might not really understand what that is. A lot of people hear paint correction, they think you're going to fix the paint. In a way, we are doing that, but we're not doing some things. So things like rock chips and super deep scratches where you can catch your fingernail or you can see the metal underneath or the primer underneath the paint, that's not going to be taken care of with a paint correction. But what is are those very fine, small scratches that you see, like when the sun hits the side of your car and lights it up and you see all of these like spider web looking marks. That is what we can take care of with a paint correction. So this includes things like what we call micro scratches, which is what you're seeing a lot of times in the sun, holograms, which can be caused by a high-speed buffer if somebody didn't really know what they were doing or didn't finish down correctly, maybe at a body shop or a dealership after they use a high-speed buffer. And I'm gonna talk about the differences of the various buffers that people use to accomplish this. And also other visible defects in the clear coat. So that is things like bug gut etchings or bird dropping etchings, things like that, water spots. Sometimes water spots can be so bad you really can't remove them. Paint correction is designed to take care of as much of that as humanly possible. We never promise perfection, but we can get it pretty darn close, and we'll show you some shots of what that looks like. I already touched on it briefly, but what does a paint correction not do? And that's something that's very important to understand if you're a consumer that's going to be paying for the paint correction. I already mentioned rock chips. We're not going to do anything with those rock chips. If there's one here and there while we're doing a paint correction, we might do some touch up, but if the whole front of the car is peppered with rock chips, we're not going to be able to take care of those with a paint correction. It also doesn't remove orange peel. For those of you that don't know what that is, if you get close to your paint, actually even from here I can see on the Chevy Equinox, the reflection of the things around it are not a perfect crisp image. There's like a little bit of waviness to it. And the reason is because the clear coat is not perfectly level. So it has sort of these mountains and valleys in it, and it creates a look that really sort of looks like the surface of an orange. So we refer to that as orange peel in the industry. Now some cars really don't have much or any of that. For instance, Bentleys and Rolls Royces and a lot of Lamborghinis, they have very, very clear paint. And that's because they spend a lot more time in the finishing process after the car is painted. Now cars like Chevrolet and Dodge and most of the Japanese cars, they're gonna have a little bit of that, even Porsche, and that's normal. And there's nothing wrong with that. Most cars will have some orange peel. So how do I tell if I need a paint correction? There's a couple of different ways. I already mentioned that if you catch it in the sun and you see all those spider webbing marks, it might be time to call a detailer and find out what he can do for you. But also, you can accomplish the same thing by using a high-powered LED light. Most of you probably have one of these in your garage. Basically just a work light that you plug into the wall. That will usually show you a lot of things. Also, just a little handheld LED flashlight can work wonders also. A lot of our paint correction experts, you'll see them using that as they're paint correcting to sort of really check a spot as they're polishing the paint. If I decide I need a paint correction or think I might need one, the question comes up, can you paint correct any car? And that's sort of a loaded question because the answer is yes to some degree, but also there's some pitfalls you have to avoid. So number one, I'll talk about the difference between single stage paint and base coat, clear coat paint. So what you're used to seeing on the road now, ever since I want to say early 90s, maybe even late 80s, most manufacturers switched from a single paint where they spray it on and that's it. It's thick. It's the type of paint that you'll see that will oxidize quickly. It will sort of look like chalky looking. Older cars, this happens to a lot if they haven't been refinished. Newer paint though, and that's what we're going to focus on for the purpose of this video, is a primer and then a paint and then a clear coat on top of that. The clear coat is a very thin layer of urethane that goes on top, and that really protects the paint underneath. It's got UV inhibitors in it to protect from fading, and it gives you that super high gloss look that you see on most new cars today. But what can happen sometimes is that clear coat can take on damage, and that's what the paint correction is going to help remove. Paint defects in that thin layer of clear on top of the paint. So you can paint correct single stage paint. If you've ever done it, if you're a detailer, then you know that as you're working the pad, you'll actually see some of the paint come off on the pad. It's like paint transfer. So you're directly removing the paint as you're polishing. And if you're using a very mild polish, that's something that can be done over and over and over again, and it's really not a big deal. But if you're trying to chase scratches and things out of a single stage paint, it can become a very dangerous game and sort of a gamble as far as how much you can polish before you cause irreversible damage in that painted surface. So the same thing can be said of clear coat though. The difference is, as you're polishing, your pad isn't turning a different color because you're not pulling paint off the surface. It's a clear product that you're removing. So let's talk about clear coat and how thick it is. When we talk about clear coat, we're not talking in terms of millimeters or anything like that. We're talking in terms of microns, which are extremely small. Most paint jobs, the clear coat on top, which is what we're polishing, is only going to be 25 to 50 microns. Now, if you're like me, you don't really understand what that means because you're not a scientist working in a lab somewhere, but I do understand what a piece of paper is, and the thickness of a piece of paper is about twice as thick as your clear coat from factory on most cars. If you pick up a piece of printer paper right now and look at it, it's pretty incredible that we're able to do anything with something that's half as thick as this and not completely destroy it. So clear coat is pretty resilient. Now, the important thing to note about a paint correction is when you're polishing, you are actually removing some of that clear coat. And the reason that's important is because there is a finite amount of clear there. Like I showed you, it's about half the thickness of a piece of paper. So when you start buffing, you better really know what you're doing, using the correct pad and compound combination so you don't damage what's there. Once you damage it, it's impossible to go back. You can't just add a little bit of clear coat. In order to fix that, you're repainting potentially a panel or even more than that, and if you damage the paint underneath the clear, it can get extremely expensive. Then you'd have to blend panels into other panels to make the car look right, and we're gonna make videos on that, and it's just not a fun process that you get involved in. So you have to be very, very careful when you're polishing paint, whether it's you or a professional detailer. That's why it's important to take it to a place that knows what they're doing, that has some paint correction under their belt. Here at Blackout, we do 5 to probably 8 paint corrections a week, every single week. We've been doing that for many years. So we know the combos of pads and compounds and polishes that you can use. The question of how many times can I paint correct a car varies wildly. It depends on what happened to the car previously. So even if you bought it new, I can tell you lots of stories where somebody brings in a brand new car and there's paint damage. Sometimes people bring in a brand new car and there's buffer trails all over it. So somebody already sort of attacked that paint to try to remove scratches or some type of mark in the clear coat. Now, how much clear did they remove at the dealership? We have no idea. So I want to talk to you about the methods that exist to correct paint. There's a couple of different ways you can remove defects from paint. I'm going to start with the most aggressive, and that is wet sanding. Now, for those of you that are watching this that are detailers, you said wet sanding isn't paint correction. You're right, but it is sort of a process that some people use. We don't use it much here, that can aid in the paint correction process. And what wet sanding is exactly what it sounds like. You're actually taking sandpaper to the clear coat. Now, if you know anything about sanding anything, you know you're removing a lot of material when you do that. So think of that piece of paper and sandpaper on it, it gets kind of scary. Now, obviously, when you're using sandpaper on your paint, you're not going to be using 80 grit. You're using super fine sandpaper like a 2000 grit or I've seen even up to 5,000. I think 3M makes a sanding disc that's up to 5,000. And a lot of people use that by hand or by a machine. That is removing layers of clear coat. And when you're done wet sanding, you'll notice a super dull appearance, and it's kind of terrifying if it's the first time you've ever done it, because it looks like you totally ruined the paint job. Fortunately, that paint can then be polished back to life. And so if you have super bad orange peel that you're trying to remove, or a really deep scratch, sometimes you'll get into wet sanding. Now, again, that sort of falls out of the category of paint correction, and it's not something that we do often. It's definitely not something we recommend, especially on a factory paint job. Aftermarket paint, a lot of times that's a lot thicker, and part of the finishing process of a paint job usually involves some type of wet sanding. But when it comes to a detail shop, we're gonna use one of two things, and that's a random orbital buffer and a high-speed buffer. Now, if you are an old school detailer or an old school body shop guy, you probably swear by the high-speed DeWalt buffer. You'll see it in even movies and stuff when somebody's buffing a car. It's usually with a high speed. It's a big, huge, like almost like an angle grinder looking thing with like a 12-inch, usually a wool pad that you see on it. Those are very effective at removing defects quickly. They spin very fast, they get the paint hot, and that type of tool can be extremely useful in the hands of somebody that knows how to use it properly. It can also be extremely destructive in the hands of somebody that doesn't know what they're doing with it. We here at Blackout do not generally use a high-speed buffer really for much of anything. We've found that over the years, a random orbital buffer can accomplish basically the same thing as a high speed, although it might be slightly slower. We just don't have enough experience with a high speed because we weren't around. Really, most of the guys that work here are relatively young, and we didn't grow up using those. We've grown up using the random orbitals with the newer compounds and things like that that are able to accomplish the same thing with less danger, I guess. So it makes it a little bit easier to train somebody and also less risk to the customer's car. So what is a random orbital? Those are the smaller buffers, usually like a 6-inch or 5-inch pad that you see on them. And it's called a random orbital because in addition to spinning around like a high speed, it also orbits. So that creates sort of a vibration that happens and allows the pad to move in a couple of different directions and doesn't allow for a massive heat buildup. So you're not worried about burning the paint. And with a high speed, that's actually a concern. You can see burn marks sometimes. Especially if you look at body shop work that maybe wasn't very good, you'll see those burn marks. A random orbital, you really won't see that. The other difference is the entire pad contacts the surface. When you're using a high speed, usually you're using sort of the edge of the pad. The random orbital, you'll see somebody and it'll be like the whole pad is flat on the surface or as much as possible. We use different compounds and different pad combinations to remove defects. So we have things like microfiber pads that are very aggressive. They're gonna quickly remove those defects. The problem is they leave some stuff behind. Then we have foam pads, and there's different hardnesses basically to those foam pads. We have orange, we've got red, and we've got black. Every one of those pads is slightly different in the amount that it corrects. That's where I say you have to be pretty educated in how to use those different pad combos. And then the different compounds. There's 10 million different companies at this point that make their own detailing products. They make different compounds that accomplish different things. They make different polishes. There's a lot of different categories in there. So with the compounds, for instance, we have regular compounds, and then we have diminishing compounds. What that means is the product that you're putting, the actual liquid product that you're putting on the pad of your orbital, the diminishing ones can actually start as a little bit more abrasive, and then as you're working it into the panel, will sort of diminish down, basically become a polish by the end of it. Those work really, really well for like single stage polishes. If you're somebody that, if you have a customer or you are a customer that doesn't want to pay for a full paint correction, you might want to just do a quick once over. And some of those compounds are really impressive at finishing down and can almost accomplish what a paint correction can. And that'll bring back a lot of gloss and color to the car, but may not remove every single scratch under a high powered light. Then we have polishes, and those are very, very fine abrasives that when you're using those, you're almost removing nothing from the clear coat. That's usually what we're finishing up with before we do a ceramic coating or even a good wax. That leads me to wax. What is wax in comparison to the compounds and polishes, and what is it doing?
Pour best of show wax on the pad and spread it around the pad like buttering a piece of bread.
On a microscopic level, the wax doesn't have any abrasives in it. The compound and polish do to some degree. So imagine like small grains of sand.
It feels like a bag of sand
Inside of the compound, and that's what's sort of rubbing on the paint to dig into it to lower that level of clear coat. And then the polish is the same thing, but less intense. And then the wax is virtually nothing, but what it does do is it fills in some of those cracks. So the reason that your car looks good after you wax it is because all of those little micro scratches and swirl marks that you see, the wax will actually sort of fill in some of those valleys. That creates more of a reflective surface. The light doesn't get sucked into those cracks and bounce around and sort of just make it distorted and not as shiny looking. That's why wax works. So wax is very effective if you don't want to spend the time or money to correct the paint, but understand when you put wax on, you're not fixing anything, you're just throwing some makeup on it. So a question that comes up here all the time is, can I do it myself? And of course the answer is yes. Anything that we can do, you can do too. But just like any professional, you might not be able to do as good of a job, or even if you can do as good of a job, it might take you twice as long, and there's a learning curve, and you have to buy a lot of tools and all that kind of stuff. So if you're somebody that loves do-it-yourself stuff, my dad is one of these people, he just wants to work on his car himself. That's awesome. We sell tools here that you can do that. There's plenty of companies online that sell tools, and there's a million videos on YouTube that will show you really how to do it. So feel free to tackle that if you think you can handle it. So that brings me to the tools. How much do they cost? How much do you have to have invested to be able to do a basic paint correction? And the tools that we use here will be listed in the description of this video. So let's give you an idea of a basic setup. So something like a Griot's Garage G9 orbital. Now that's not necessarily a professional grade orbital, but you're looking at about $160 for that machine. Then on top of that, you need pads. I would recommend probably at least 3 pads, if not more than that, because sometimes they'll get clogged up and you don't want to spend the time to clean them right now while you're in the middle of a correction. So you're looking at $20 to $25 a pad, depending on where you get those from. Then you need really good compounds and polishes, and honestly, it varies from car to car what works best, but you can get away with probably 2 or 3 different products there at $20 to $30 a product. Then microfibers are very important. The actual microfiber towel that you're using to remove the polish or the compound is coming in contact with the paint. And the reason that's important is because some towels are legitimately not soft enough to not scratch the paint. So everything that you're doing, you're undoing when you hit it with a microfiber towel. So some of those cheap microfibers that might be tempting to buy a whole bag of them over at Walmart or Advanced Auto, they'll work really well for maybe cleaning up dirty wheels or greasy spots in the interior, but we recommend something much better than that for the paint surface. We use something that is at least like, I think what we use is 420 GSM, which is sort of a measure of how many fibers are in the microfiber and how soft it is. We get ours from a company called the Rag Company. They've got tons of options on there for you to choose from, so check out the Rag Company for that. Now keep in mind, there's a lot of labor that goes into this. I mean, you're talking many, many hours to paint correct a car. If one comes in here that needs 3 or even 4 stages of correction, it might take us a day and a half or even 2 days to correct the paint up to our standards. And you have to get in all of those little creases around the badging and all that kind of stuff, or remove the badging to paint correct underneath and then reinstall it. So there's a lot that goes into it. So you're gonna have a few $100s in the tools. You're gonna have a lot of time into it. And then also the biggest concern is if you mess up. So if you accidentally do burn an edge of the paint or something like that, you could cause thousands of dollars of damage to your car. So it's important to just be careful and know what you're getting into before you start paint correcting. So what happens if I polish too much? You can actually polish too much without doing immediate damage to the paint that you see right now. So as I mentioned, you could burn the paint, you could go through the clear coat, and then obviously you have major problems. You can also just remove too much clear. The manufacturers recommend that you don't remove more than like 50% of what's there from the factory. And the reason for that is, as the clear coat cures when they paint the car, a lot of the UV inhibitors rise to the top. And that's on purpose, so that the UV stops at the top layer and it's not penetrating the clear, which is then damaging the paint and fading the paint underneath it. It's important not to polish too much. So you could polish a car or paint correct a car maybe 2, maybe 3 times, depending on how much you're removing when you do that. And then that's probably it. So where do all of these micro scratches and swirl marks come from? If you're like most of our customers, they say, I just drive this thing to and from work. It's kept in a garage and I wash it regularly and I don't understand where all of these scratches come from. Some people straight up don't believe us. After we get the car washed, we'll call them and say, hey, this happens. They say, I don't believe you. I've never seen that before, because they never really looked at their paint like that. And some people just don't care. They see that this is a blue car and as long as it looks blue, they're happy, but we obviously look at paint a different way. They can come from a lot of different things, and we see them on brand new cars, and we see them on brand new Toyotas, and we see them on brand new Lamborghinis. I always tell this story. We had a literally brand new Lamborghini Performante, or Huracan Performante. It's like a $400,000 car. He trailered it to us. I think the car had either 2 miles or 4 miles on it. There were buffer trails all over this thing, micro scratches and swirl marks all over it. So where do they come from? First, they can come from the manufacturer. When they're done with the car, they maybe don't get all of that stuff out. They can also come from shipping. If you're getting a car from overseas, chances are the car is coming over, well, not chances are, it most certainly is, coming over on a big boat. Some manufacturers pay for more space on that boat so that the cars aren't packed in like sardines. Some manufacturers pack them in like sardines. So in the process of being on the boat, things can happen. Sometimes they come off the boat and they're damaged. And we learned this because we had to go down this big rabbit hole with a Porsche 911 Turbo that it had damage on it when it came to us with 40 miles on it, and the dealer didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it. But if you chase it back to the port, you find out that they repair damage. They have body shops at the port, which is kind of frightening. And if it costs less than a certain amount of money, they don't even have to tell the dealership that they fixed it. So sometimes your car already has body work or paint work or just polishing work done at the port. Somebody at the port might not be that great with a buffer, or they really, really want to get this big long scratch out that happened and they don't care how much paint they're removing, so they just buff it until the scratch is gone. So that can happen. Also at the dealership. Let's say you have a car that's kept in the showroom floor. It seems like it's the safest place for the car to sit, right? It's not. You have people touching it all day, every day. You have dealership detailers that have to wipe the car down so that it looks good on the showroom floor, but in the process of doing that, any of that dust or anything that's sitting on the surface is getting rubbed all over the paint. Same with salespeople. Sometimes they might need to just rub a spot off, and they do that, and it scratches the paint. And it's just little by little, but that dust will eventually create a lot of those micro scratches and swirl marks. If the car sits outside of the dealership, it might sit in the back corner of a lot for 3 months before you come in and buy the car. In that process, bird droppings, dust from the air. We're right over a runway, or right beside a runway here. The planes come right over top of us. I'm looking at a dealership right here, so as those planes go over, some of the like, I don't know if they call it jet wash or whatever, but the stuff from the fuel in the jet can be landing on top of that. So there's just dirt and grime and all that kind of stuff accumulating on the surface of the car. Then it goes into the detail bay and they wash it, and they're rubbing it around on the surface of the car. Now, if you have a very good detailer at that dealership, they might be able to mitigate it to some degree, but chances are they're scratching it a little bit before you even get it. The big one is car washes. If you're somebody that says, I wash my car religiously, and you don't do it by hand, even if you do it by hand, there are many things you could be doing incorrectly that can lead to swirl marks. Car washes, especially the ones with the big swirling brushes and the flaps that are smacking all over the car, those things aren't cleaned all the time. They're not cleaned between every car. So think of it as the truck before you might be covered in mud. He might have been out hunting this weekend, and there's rocks and mud and tar and all over his car, and those brushes might take it off, and now they're in the brushes, and now you're driving your Corvette through there, and now your Corvette's covered in all the swirl marks and everything that those are causing. So we never recommend a car wash that physically touches the car. That leads you to touchless car washes. Touchless car washes can work. They can be okay. The problem with that is because they're not touching the car, there's nothing to agitate the dirt on the surface there. Now they're relying on very harsh chemicals to remove the things from your paint and the wheels and the plastics, either a very basic chemical composition or very acidic. That kind of stuff is really not good for the paint either. What we suggest for the best washing techniques to minimize swirl marks as much as possible is a pH balanced soap like the Griot's Garage Car Wash with a 2-bucket method with grit guards, with very clean microfiber towels, just wash, never touch another car, air drying the car with a leaf blower or with like a master blaster. There's some detailing products that are designed for that, or a very high quality microfiber drying towel. If you're watching this and you say, you guys are nuts, you care way too much about paint, you're right, we do. We spend many, many hours working on cars here that the customers care very much about, and we want to make sure it is perfect, and that once it leaves here, the customer understands how to keep it perfect. We also use an iron decontaminant chemical, and that is going to remove a lot of the sort of like rail dust and things like that that end up embedded in the clear coat from shipping or even from your brake rotors and stuff like that. And that'll give us a little bit of a cleaner surface to start the polishing. We also clay bar the car, and that is literally taking a bar of clay and using a lubricant and wiping it on the top of the clear coat. And what that does is, if you can imagine the clear coat is like an ocean, or ocean's pretty turbulent, I guess, like a lake that's perfectly smooth, and you see a log or a rock sticking up. Sometimes you think it's a turtle, or maybe it is a turtle. But basically, if you could take something over the surface of that and just remove that log from the surface to make it more smooth, that's what the clay bar is doing to the clear coat. It's grabbing those contaminants and pulling them out of the clear. When you're done clay barring, if you did it correctly, you will feel a super, super smooth surface. Now, if the car is really bad and needs clay barred really badly, and you aren't using a clay bar that's brand new, possibly, you could actually be putting micro scratches and swirl marks in the paint when you're clay barring it. Now, of course, before paint correction, we don't really care that much about that as long as we're not putting big scratches in it, because we're gonna remove those anyhow. So after paint correction, how do I keep it looking that good? And there's a couple of different ways. I already mentioned proper wash techniques. That is number one, do that. Number two is a ceramic coating. It will help sort of lock that in. Then you still have to wash it correctly to make sure you don't cause scratches in your ceramic coating. Will a ceramic coating protect your paint correction? To some degree, yes, but you still have to know what you're doing. The most effective way to keep your paint looking that way forever is paint protection film, and that is a very thick urethane barrier that gets installed over top of the paint. Once that's on there, anything that comes in contact with the car is just coming in contact with the surface of the paint protection film and not your clear coat. So that's the best way, most effective way to keep your car looking good forever. So guys, thank you very much for watching this extremely in-depth dive on paint corrections and what it is and how you can prevent it and all that stuff. We hope you enjoyed something like this. We're gonna try to do some more like deep dives into detailing concepts. And yeah, we will see you on the next video. We appreciate you watching. Make sure you subscribe, give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thanks very much.